What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. We're a week out from a new season. Let's rate every card in the Origins of Apocalypse season coming up in March. Now, these ratings will be done to the best of my ability, but keep in mind they are still attempting to predict the future. This is notoriously risky. As always, if you like this video, leave a comment, like, and subscribe. It really helps me out. We're going to start with the Season Pass card, En Sabanur, who is demoing the new mechanic Objective. En Sabanur is a card that says, Objective, have your front row full. The 0 out of 6 means that we're looking at the front row across every location. When you have your front row full, he transforms from a 4/5 En Sabanur to a 4/8 Apocalypse Celestials Chosen. That transformation comes with Apocalypse's on-reveal ability, which looks at your front row, takes the worst card in it, and swaps it out for something else in your deck. This is a card that I think is particularly interesting in the context of what Marvel Snap is nowadays, which is to say, I don't see a way to make this incredibly stupid by duplicating it. Obviously, I would imagine that you can duplicate objectives with things like Prodigy or copy objectives with things like Magus, but I do think that largely this does not have the volume of doublers available to it that something like Star-Lord has currently. Similarly, I don't see a way to take its output and multiply it because the output is so not fixed. You're not getting a card that costs more than your card or a card that has more power than your card. A lot of the upside in this is just going to be getting rid of something and potentially getting something else, which means that a lot of this is going to be in deck building. You're going to want to find cards that are great to get rid of, and you're going to want to find cards that are great to cycle into. In terms of great to get rid of, the obvious answer is the Hood, but I would imagine that in most cases, if you asked somebody, could I take my 1-drop and replace it with anything else and would I feel good about that? The answer would probably be yes. Inasmuch as this card has problems, those problems are related to what kind of card this is and what kind of metagame we're currently in. This is an incremental value card. It is a card that is, I think, doing stuff that is pretty small ball. You're playing the Hood, you're getting rid of the Hood. That's a nice little thing to do, but it's not really much compared to an entire giant Fin Fang Foom. That kind of thing is what might hold this card back. Another card that might hold it back is the power of Sholau, the power of Batroc. It doesn't seem like it wants to be in those decks or goes in those decks. But at the same time, this is effectively just a 4/8 that in any deck that you're playing the Hood in is just going to be some pretty reasonable and large upside. I think also you could look at this as a sort of backup Annihilus for a Sentry game plan. That Merlin Sentry stuff, this is a reasonable card in that context. But the other thing that holds this card back is the 4 on its cost. I think that that's actually quite a large issue with how this card ends up playing out, because it has to really start carrying. Once you get to 4-cost stuff, they've got to have really massive impacts on the board, and I'm not sure this guy is going to be able to. The other thing is, once you get to 4-cost stuff, you're starting looking at like, okay, maybe I can put this in a ramp deck, but 4 is a really bad cost for anything to be in a ramp deck. So he probably doesn't go there as a way of removing Electro, which is weird because you kind of want him to be the thing that gets rid of things you don't like having on the board. But he's just going to be worse than Blink at doing that. He might not even happen the way ramp plays out some of the time. So what exactly are we doing with this that isn't the Hood? I think that's the biggest question that I have. I only really see a future for this with the Hood, and I worry that that's not a good enough future for it to be in. So I'm going to say this card is going to be a 3-star card. Now, I want to remind you, this is a very contextual rating. This is a card that I think has a lot of potential that could do a lot of different things. But largely, when I look at it, I see a card that doesn't fit in the metagame as constructed. If that changes, then maybe this rating will end up wrong one way or the other. But as is, I just feel like this guy is relatively unexciting compared to the previous 2 season passes especially. Iska the Unbeaten carries with her a promise of potentially reviving Invisible Woman First Steps. There are a couple of things that are worth talking about with Iska the Unbeaten. The first is if you can stick her in a lane with something that is making that lane worse. Again, we look at the Hood, we look at Sentry, we look at that kind of stuff. She will continually get larger and larger and larger. Like, baseline speaking, the thing you do with Iska the Unbeaten is you put her in a lane where she's going to be able to double, and then on the final turn of the game, they have to invest very hard into that lane. She doubles at the end of turn 4 up to 6, doubles at the end of turn 5 up to 12, and then suddenly she represents 24 power, in that if your opponent wants to try to win that lane, they have to play around her being potentially 24. Now, there are a couple of other wrinkles that are worth talking about here. Obviously, with Invisible Woman First Steps, this card just says for infinity. Is that bad? Like, I don't really know the right way to phrase this. Like, is that an oppressive thing? And we do a lot of combo stuff in Marvel Snap right now that makes me think that it's a little less oppressive than what we have currently, because you are able to interact with it in the form of things like Cosmic Ghost Rider, right? Like, the thing that Invisible Woman First Steps is really bad about is getting interacted with, because it's so face up on the board. It's even more face up than something like a Star-Lord is, but at the same time, there aren't a ton of answers to it. It's kind of just Deafening Chord and Cosmic Ghost Rider, and then, you know, maybe if you're really desperate, you're playing Ghost, but you're probably not going to do that. And so you end up with a card that I think has answers, but I don't think those answers are things that people particularly want to be doing. That said, there's other answers, you know, like Sonicking lanes that this card would go in. That kind of stuff is really powerful. I do think that largely, if I play this card, what I'm doing with it is Invisible Woman First Steps. And I do think that it's going to be strong enough when you do that, that it's going to feel like a really powerful card coming out. But there are some really notable counters to this. I mean, if they're not going to be able to Invisible Woman First Steps you, and they're just doing like I'm playing this to threaten 24 power in a lane, you Shadow King it when it's at 12, and then it's 6 power, and they lose the game, right? Like, that is the big risk of this card, is that what you're doing when you're playing any deck that involves this card is setting yourself up to be blown out when you do your combo. Oh, I've done my combo. I have Invisible Woman First Steps. It sure would be a shame if my opponent played Cosmic Ghost Rider with priority and then I lost the game, right? Like, that kind of stuff is what you really have to worry about. Oh, I've done my Hood Sentry stuff. I can't wait to play Annihilus and send them over, and my Iska is representing 24 power in that lane. Wow, it's amazing. Except they play Shadow King. And it's just like, oh, okay, I've done all this stuff, but my final turn is not reliable enough. I still do think this card is going to be good, to be clear. I just think it's going to be the kind of good that's like pretty clearly dealable with, as long as you're willing to do that. But I also think that like the player base has demonstrated that if things aren't clearly dealable with, or that there are different tiers of clearly dealable with, right? I consider Star-Lord pretty clearly dealable with. I think most people at top of Infinite consider Star-Lord pretty dealable with. But most people everywhere else do not. And that's not to say that anyone is right or wrong about this, just like the facts of something like this. I think in order for a card to be considered pretty dealable with by the large majority of the population, it's got to have like a really easy answer. It's got to have like a Mobius to the Mr. Negative. You can't be like, oh, I'm going to do priority stuff and have the majority of the population consider that a card that is meaningfully being dealt with. So I think there's a very real chance that this is a card that scares a lot of people. This is a card that loses a lot of people a lot of games. This is a card that people are like, oh my God, I can't believe they did this. Because I do think the Invisible Woman stuff is strong enough to make you have to interact with it. And that is what this card is going to be doing. Like, this is a very, very threatening card. Even if it's not in itself going to win the lane by 10 billion power, it doesn't matter. It always wins the lane by as much as you need. And that's just really powerful. I think this is a 4.5-star card. Granted, I only think that in the context of Invisible Woman First Steps, and if it turns out people adjust to Invisible Woman First Steps, that's one thing. But this is going to make people have to adjust to Invisible Woman First Steps. I wouldn't be shocked if people were like, this is a 5-star card coming out of the season. I wouldn't be shocked if Invisible Woman First Steps Iska was the bad guy of the entire season. I genuinely, that would not surprise me in any meaningful way. I think it is extremely possible that this card represents the thing everyone is afraid of every season. Like, you know how every season there's like, who's the bad guy this time? Very possible that it's Iska. On to Juggernaut Horsemen of War, who is a card that I think is pretty underpowered, and I'd be interested to see what he can actually do. Because my thinking on how good a cheap card with a lot of power is depends on how strong that card is a lot of the time. When you look at how I feel about something like Batroc and Craven and Sam Wilson and Hydra Stomper, I look at those cards as a little bit overpowered because they synergize so well together, they scale each other well, and they all are cheap scalers that do a lot of relatively uncapped output compared to something like Juggernaut, which is a 2/8, right? This is a 2/8. You play this because you want it to be a 2/8. The objective at a 2/2 stat line is have 6 cards with different powers, and if you do that, it will be a 2/8. That is pretty much a very reasonable ask. I think there are going to be a lot of decks that can do that. I just don't know if you're looking for a capped 2/8. I don't really know about that. I think it's going to be a very doable task. This is, if anyone remembers the Data Mined Eson, that was a card that asked you to do this in deck building and gave all your cards +2 power, a much stronger version of this effect that I think was largely unprintable. But this is asking you to do it in play and then also asking you to have this in play. And I think that makes this card, I don't know, like a 2.5 out of 5, if I had to guess, maybe a 2 out of 5. I don't think there's anything wrong with this. I think, like, you'll see it sometimes, but it's going to require some specific non-combo related context. Like, this is a card, I think maybe we're playing it in Supergiant, right? That's the kind of deck where it's like, I actually really do want a 2/8. I'm very happy to play a 2/8, and I use my interaction to make sure no opponents can combo over the top of me. That's the biggest thing you have going for it. And if we're talking about invisible when first steps counters, a la Iska, Supergiant's pretty good at that. So this is the kind of card that I think on its own, you know, not a great card. In the specific context of Supergiant coming out, this could actually be a really good card. Like, there is a very real world where Supergiant becomes the thing you do to counter Star-Lord and to counter Invisible Woman First Steps. And this is a card that I actually think is just actively good in Supergiant. There is a lot of different power in that deck. I suspect you will get this mostly for free. And that's really good. That's just a really good thing to do. So with that in mind, I think that the 2.5 that my initial reaction is might not be accurate to how this card is actually going to shape up in the metagame we're going to be into. That said, outside of Supergiant, I don't think I'm doing anything with this, but it does have this incredibly specific use case that I think is probably going to be pretty damn good. And so with that in mind, I'm going to give this a split rating. This is going to be a 2 anywhere else, but a 4 in Supergiant. I am calling my shot. This is a risky thing to do. I'm very much predicting the future here, and that is always dangerous. I learned that from A Song of Ice and Fire. Prophecy betrays you. That said, this is going to be a 4-star card in Supergiant and literally nowhere else. Gambit Horsemen of Death is a card that begs one major question. Why would you ever make a second Gambit? This is an objective at 3/3 that says play 5 total cost of created cards and then randomly destroy 4 total cost of enemy cards. There are several questions that make this card difficult to rate. If you play a Valentina card, does it check the entire cost of the card, or does it check the amount you paid for the card? If you play a Mysterio, is that 6 cost of created cards because all of them are on the board at 2 cost? If you play an Iron Patriot, is it counting the discounted number or the base number? If you play a Quinjet, is it counting the discounted number or the base number? All of these are going to be really important questions for if this card ends up being as good as I think it is. But at baseline, I look at this card and I see the other card in the season that I think could be a legitimate terror for the entire metagame. This is going to be the kind of card that is going to gatekeep certain decks out of existence. And I think that it is extremely powerful if even 1 or 2 of those interactions I mentioned work. Because you're going to be doing something like playing a Mysterio, playing a Gambit, prodigying the Gambit to get an extra objective trigger, and then suddenly you're looking at destroying 8 energy worth of your opponent's stuff. And yeah, there's stuff that's going to be able to get past this. For example, a Doom 2099 deck does not care about this at all. A ramp deck doesn't care about this at all. A Star-Lord doesn't care about this at all. But a lot of other stuff does. And this is going to be the kind of card that like sets boundaries for what you're allowed to do. I expect this card to be powerful. I expect this to be a 4.5-star card. I think it is going to be a legitimately threatening and hard to deal with card. But I also think a lot of that is wrapped up in the 3 specific cards that I just talked about. Valentina, Mysterio, and Iron Patriot. And I know from data miners that these interactions are not necessarily set in stone. In fact, the last I heard from a data miner in my Discord, if you tried to play Gambit and Mysterio at the same time, well, what would happen is the game would crash instead of anything actually happening. So I don't actually know how this is going to work. We have suppositions, but I don't think we can be sure just yet. That said, if two of those interactions work and you can Prodigy this guy, which that part I am pretty confident you can do, I expect this guy to be a big part of the metagame. He is going to be the kind of thing that puts downward pressure on mid-range decks. I'm typically pretty against those kind of cards existing, and this is a lot of power to put into a card like that. It's also going to be, I think, notably pretty decent against things like, Batroc or Invisible Woman first steps. Like, that kind of stuff, you got hits there. Now, it's never going to hit the big stuff, and so there are going to be decks that are totally immune from this. It's going to be a deck that's legitimately very easy to counter because just do something that doesn't get blown up by Gambit. Like, you're going to be fine. But there are going to be some real metagame repercussions from this. The fact that it's dealable with is the only thing holding me back from putting it at 5 stars. That's what's making it a 4.5-star card for me. You know what I'm doing here. It's Sandstorm. I didn't really do the song well enough, but it's fine. You'll have to imagine it for yourself. Sandstorm is a big boost to Victoria Hand, actually. When I look at this card, which is a skill that costs 2, and on reveal adds 2 rocks to your hand and gives them +1 power for each of your front row characters, I look at a card that's basically adding 2 demons. It's probably not literally always adding 2 demons, but most of the time you play this card, it's going to be 2 guys that are pretty reasonably big, and your Victoria Hand, you're going to feel really happy about that. Victoria Hand is a deck that struggles with board space, which means in large part that it often invests a lot of small things onto the board early. And that is actually something that this card is paying off. I don't expect it to not continue to struggle with board space or anything like that, but I do expect it to get something like Gambit, to get something like Sandstorm, and to become a meaningfully stronger deck. I think Sandstorm is just good. I think this is an extremely powerful card in an extremely specific niche, and that extremely specific niche is either in the Rocks deck or in Victoria Hand with a lean towards Victoria Hand. My guess is that this is a 3.5 to 4-star card, but again, this is going to fall into the same range as Apocalypse, where you're sitting there looking at it and you're like, wait a minute, is this actually big enough to beat any of the stuff that's going big, right? I'm playing Sandstorm and stuff, and my opponent has an Iska that's 48 power or whatever. I'm playing Sandstorm and stuff. My opponent has a Star-Lord and a bunch of Fin Fang Fooms. That kind of dynamic is true with Gambit, and it's true with this as well. A lot of these cards are really good at being mid-rangey cards and being really efficient card generators. But we aren't in a world where we care about efficiency. We're in a world where we care about volume. We care about raw output. And I don't know that the output of decks like this is going to be good enough to keep up with something like a Star-Lord, something like a Ramp, something like a Doom 2099. I think it can keep up with Doom 2099, but we have to ask these questions. And so you end up with a fairly interesting situation, I think, where this is the kind of thing that, in a normal world, I'd be like, oh my God, V-hand is already so good. It's getting so many buffs. There's so many good things happening. It's going to be amazing. And now I think V-hand is probably going to be a good deck with Gambit and Sandstorm, but I also think that, it kind of needs those cards to be a good deck, right? It's not a very good deck right now. It needs the boost. It's not like this is a situation where one of the best decks in the game is getting stronger. This is a situation where a deck that used to be good is getting some tools to allow it to compete now. So I don't think these are making it to 5 stars. Even though I really like them, I don't think that's going to happen. I think this stuff is still too easily dealt with by going over the top of it, and that will be a meaningful part of the metagame. And thus, I would say that this is about a 3.5-star card, even though I really want to give it higher rankings. Caliban, Horsemen of Pestilence at 3/4, objective, have 3 cards that are 4 cost or higher in play. Result, afflict the highest cost enemy card with -7 power. I think this guy is probably a pretty free include in Doom 2099. If Wiccan were remotely playable, I would say he's probably a free include there. It's possible you play him in Star-Lord, but I would consider that relatively unlikely because of the way Star-Lord wants to be curving out. But I just think this is a solid, good card for any deck playing fair Marvel Snap. Now, are we gonna be playing fair Marvel Snap? Do I want to play an objective card that dies to my opponent's Gambit? All of that stuff, I think, is what's really coming up when you talk about this kind of thing. My instinct is that what you want to do against a Gambit is play like a 2 and a 3 and be like, one of these is dying, but the other one isn't. And I think that kind of stuff is reasonable, but it's still like, okay, all right, I'm not really sure I feel good about that play pattern if I'm going to put this guy in my deck. We're going to be racing to the objective, and they're probably faster to it than me. That said, I think this is just a solid card, like a 3-star card that is not particularly special, and if it does become special, will largely be through just being the kind of thing that tags along with something else that is already good. This is not a card that you are building around per se. This is a card that is interesting and cool, but it's just an additive thing. It's the world's most okayest card. And that is largely how I consider this card. Selene is a 4/4 objective that Quest have 3 cards with no abilities in play. Result, steal 5 power from an enemy card here. So this is a 4/14 if you play the card Ultron. I actually like playing the card Ultron. I think it's a nice little addition to things that can actually do cool stuff. But what I'm worried about is I don't know what else I'm doing if I'm playing Selene. I actually spent a little bit of time in a voice call with Butt messing around with like a Patriot Ultron deck right now. And it was like, okay. It wasn't good, but it was like, okay. But the big thing that really stuck out was I don't have other cards that are doing anything that are going to allow me to like get good scaling off this Patriot. It's just like Ultron or bust. Everything else is mid. It's like Squirrel Girl and Wasp. And granted, we will have Sandstorm, and that is pretty interesting. And I'm interested in trying this in what could be a future Rocks deck. I've got Sandstorm. There's a card we're about to talk about called Ozymandias that is a Rock Lord. All of that kind of stuff seems pretty compelling to me. I can see this deck being a real thing that I would want to do. And, you know, a 4/14 is nothing to sneeze at. But it also has this mid-range problem. Oh, okay. You know, I made a 4/14. That's a really good guy. I played an Ultron. That's a lot of value. Cool. My opponent Fin Fang Foomed and Arnim Zola. It's like, okay, yeah, that's not great. Like, this is a deck that will live or die based on what the general point ceiling of the metagame is. How big are things in this world? How many points do you have to deal with your opponent outputting? And I think that this is the kind of deck that like looks to me like it could be a very solid tier 2, tier 1.5 kind of thing to do. Between Sandstorm and Ultron and Ozymandias, there are things that I think are pretty appealing about this setup. You're going to be able to do some real, genuine metagame level stuff with Ultron that I don't think you could have done previously. But I don't know if it's going to be good enough to hit tier 1. And this card is really, really, really scary being at 4 cost because sometimes you would just rather play a Moonstone, right? So I don't know if this card is even necessarily going to be a big part of it if I'm doing a Patriot thing, right? Like that kind of stuff also matters. Largely, when I look at this card, I see a card that I like, but I see a card that I'm worried about whether or not its deck is actually going to hit. And I think that it might not be a guaranteed inclusion if that deck does hit. That said, I think this is a 3.5 star card. Ozymandias is a 5/9 with an ongoing that says your rocks have +3 power. And here's where we really get into the problems with telling the future. Because this and Sandstorm and the Selene that we just talked about all kind of look like a deck that is one deck. And so they get raised or fallen depending on whether or not that deck hits. Because if Sandstorm hits in this deck and then it also hits in V-hand, it's probably a better card than I rated it as. If this card doesn't hit, it doesn't do anything. So this is a card that has a massive delta. It's either a 1-star card if its deck isn't good, or like a 4 or 5-star card if its deck is good. My instinct is that +3 power on the rocks is really cool and really interesting and genuinely kind of a relatively strong thing to be doing. On the other hand, there aren't very good rock generators. I don't want to play Mole Man in this deck, and I probably have to. Sandstorm is the one that I really, really like. Maybe I'll be playing Debris and Sandstorm and calling it enough. Debris, by the way, almost fully triggers what's-her-face, Selene, on its own. So that's another kind of interesting thing you could be doing. But all of this stuff strikes me as very mid-rangey. I'm not doubling my impact in any way. I'm just playing a lot of things that are like efficient and good stats. And I've mentioned that before, and that is largely, if there is a problem with these cards, it's going to be that the metagame just isn't about efficient and good stats. That you're going to be doing efficient and good stats in a way that is worse than, say, Batroc Sholau, and they can interact with you profitably, and you don't really have the ability to run interaction because you're a much more static deck playing things that cost 4 and 5, right? That kind of thing is largely my biggest worry about this. And so I really like Ozymandias. I would love if this was a really good card. I think it has the potential to be a really good card. I'm going to rate it based on what I want it to be. I'm going to say this is a 4-star card. I'm going to pray that I'm right because I really want this to be a part of the metagame. I really want to live in the world of Marvel Snap where this is good. And if we don't live in the world where this is good, I think there are larger problems to be addressed. Last up is Ramatut. On reveal, use 3 on reveals from years past. I think this card is probably pretty bad. Like, I can see a world where you end up doing like Wong, Mystique, Ramatut, and then each of them doubles the on reveals you get, and then also you get like 12 on reveals. That's a very funny thing to do. I can see that happening. Most of the on reveals in the game are going to be beneficial to you. I can definitely see you doing something along these lines and just being like YOLO. I can see someone jamming this in Arishem. YOLO Ramatut on 3. Let's go. Totally see all of that. I don't see a real home for this beyond like gags, goofs and gaffs. And so for that reason, I am going to say that Ramatut is a 1.5 star card, and it's getting that half star because I think it's funny. This is a card that I think is very Kraglin-esque, where if you can't control the output, unless the output is facially and obviously broken, which I don't think it is, but it could be, and if it is, presumably that will get fixed, right? Like, this is just not the kind of card I can imagine sticking around in a world that it is actually good in. It's like the exact thing that you would nerf immediately if it was even halfway playable, because people hate it, right? This is a card that I have very little faith in, and I worry that in the world where I'm wrong, I would not be wrong for long, if that makes any sense. That said, it's a very fun card. I'm glad they're making cards that are just like, this is fun. If you're going to make a card that's like a Kraglin thing where it's like, I don't know what the output is, let's find out, at least make it a cool one. And I do think that Ramatut passes that bar. As much as I would like to say it's like, oh, this is a 1.5 star card, I'm rating it on how good I think it is. I'm not rating it on how good of a design this is, because I think this design is kind of awesome. This is just a cool-ass card that probably should exist. I just don't think it's going to win you a lot of games. I've talked a little bit about doing KMBest reviews, where I go back and sort of audit my previous predictions. I think largely I got a lot of stuff right over the last 2 months. Where I've been most wrong is my prescriptions for OTAs, which is notable. But I also think that this is a month that I also feel very unsure about. I said this in last month. I was like, okay, I was pretty sure I was right about January. February, I'm less sure about. Turns out I was right about a lot of it, but, that's luck. I'm way less sure about this because there's just so much shifting in terms of the context of what a metagame is right now and what Marvel Snap even is. This is like probably spoilers for another video I might do, but I think largely the thing is that a lot of these cards are sort of small ball Marvel Snap cards, and that's just not what the game is about right now. The game is about winning by 50. And that is a dynamic that is like worth pointing out, worth talking about, and I'll go into more in depth later. But that's also not a permanent state of affairs because it wasn't about that, right? When we had tech cards running around everywhere, the game was about dodging the tech. Now it's about figuring out what combo your opponent is playing. And that's a different kind of game, but it also means that a lot of the small stuff that would be able to thrive in a world as long as it was dodging the right tech that was people were playing is not necessarily as able to thrive. I think Gambit's a great example. I think that card is busted. That card is amazing, but there's like a whole class of decks that it just doesn't do anything about. And so it's like, that card's amazing, but you've basically locked in an entire sector of the metagame that is going to beat you 75% of the time. And I think that's a really notable difference from how cards used to be and how things used to feel in Marvel Snap. Anyway, I'll probably get into that video later. But largely, I wanted to express why there was so much uncertainty from me with this. It's like, I don't really know. Also, I also want to express, I think it's very possible that Supergiant stocks skyrocket in the next few weeks, right? Iska comes out, Invisible will win first steps, farmed by Supergiant. Supergiant is already really good into something like Star-Lord. And I think it gets a 2/8 in Juggernaut that it actually just wants to have. I think there's a lot of things pushing me in the direction of Supergiant's going to get a little bit better in the next week or two. That's something to keep an eye on. As always, I've been KMBest, you've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.